to discuss the emerging facets, the constitution and the modus operandi of the civil society activism. We are having among us today Professor T.K. Oman, a doyen of Indian sociology. Professor T.K. Oman, I welcome you in this discussion.
Thank you. Friends, today I am going to talk to you about a familiar but difficult theme. Civil society is in wide currency as a term, not only in social science, but also in everyday conversation in contemporary societies. Yet, it cannot be asserted that the term has acquired the required level of clarity. Why is it so? For one thing, the notion of civil society is of a recent origin. That is, it originated only in the 18th century. Alexis de Tocqueville, a French social scientist, too conceptualized civil society as the theater of private interest and economic activity, but he distinguished it from political society, in which he included activities undertaken by political parties, local self-governments, religious groups, moral crusades, literary and scientific societies, the press, professional and commercial organizations, clubs and associations, etc., etc. But taking into account the contemporary developments, it is more appropriate to designate Tocqueville's political society as civil society. Why is it so? Contemporary societies stand on three relatively autonomous but necessarily independent pillars: state, market and civil society. Therefore, instead of encapsulating the market, that is the economy, into the civil society, it is more relevant to consider it as falling between the economic structure and the state as proposed by the Italian social scientist Gramsci. But the precision that Gramsci obtained by bifurcating the economic structure and civil society is lost through his conceptualization of the state, which incorporates both political society and civil society. In Gramsci's rendition, political society is the arena of coercion and domination, and civil society is that of consent and direction. But the incorporation of civil society into the state robs the latter of its legal autonomy and the former of its real purpose, namely functioning as a countervailing power to the state as and when it is required. John Keynes' perspective accords well with this, and let me quote a small sentence from him. Without a secure and independent civil society, autonomous public spheres, goals such as freedom and equality, participatory planning and community decision making will be nothing but empty slogans. But without the protective, redistributive and conflict mediating functions of the state, struggles to transform civil society will become ghettoized, divided and stagnant, or will spawn their own new forms of inequality and unfreedom, unquote. But it is necessary to bring in the third dimension, namely economy or market, to inform contemporary societies with the required completion, because as I already told you, there are three pillars on which contemporary societies stand: the state, civil society and the market. What I am suggesting is that for an adequate understanding of civil society, the discussion on the conceptual triology of state, market and civil society is an imperative need because of their intricate interrelations. Limitations of time prevent me from undertaking this task, but it is absolutely necessary to characterize the three entities in terms of their contents. The state encapsulates parliamentary institutions, courts, government, bureaucracies and defense forces. The market refers to the arena of production, exchange and consumption of goods and services. Civil society consists of political parties, voluntary associations, the media and the wide varieties of non-government organizations, NGOs. Each of these entities operate in reciprocity while retaining their autonomy. It is necessary to dispel a widely held naive notion about civil society at this juncture, namely that it is always and necessarily positive in its orientation. This is a simplistic view. Just as the state may be democratic or authoritarian, or the market can be competitive or monopolistic, the civil society will invariably consist of both negative and positive or democratic and authoritarian elements. The position that negative and authoritarian elements should be exorcised from society is a laudable one, but freedom of expression and association cannot be denied to any collectivity in a democratic society. What is available to men, secularists, Brahmins, bourgeoisie or nationalists cannot be denied to women, believers, Dalits, the proletariat or even religious fundamentalists. However, one can insist that all social groups should pursue their goals through legitimate and peaceful means. This is the fundamental requirement of civil society in an open democratic society. Another crucial clarification needs to be made about civil society at this point. In the conventional understanding, the acknowledged hero of civil society was the individual. However, all individuals were not entitled to the freedom of civil society, be it ownership of property or exercise of franchise. In fact, only the property owning males were given the entitlements in the beginning, although these privileges were gradually extended to everybody irrespective of gender, caste, religion, race, language, tribe and other identities. But if individuals are denied equality precisely because they belong to particular groups, these groups as groups should be recognized as inhabitants of civil society. The point I am trying to make is not only individuals, but groups are also a part of civil society. Now, such steps, that is making groups or recognizing groups as an important element in civil society, may not be required in all societies. For example, if a society is only stratified based on gender, age, class, rural urban differences and the like, by extending individual based equality to all, a firm foundation for the crystallization of civil society can be laid. But if a society is heterogeneous, consisting of different races, religions, castes, language and the like, the principle of equality of opportunity in itself will not lead to the formation of a robust civil society. For this to happen, the identity of the traditionally disadvantaged groups should be taken into account, which is to say, the idea of groups surrendering their identity in order that they be treated as equal individual citizens is no more an acceptable one. Citizens insist that they be allowed to retain their group identity, but at the same time be entitled for all the privileges as citizens. This is a conundrum between equality and identity which renders civil society an intricate and complex entity. With this general understanding of civil society as a space between the state and market, as well as the recognition of the need to maintain reciprocity and autonomy between these three entities, that is state, civil society and the market, let us look at the situation in independent India. There were two competing models of society when India achieved political freedom. One model was that of capitalist democracies of the West. These polities had evolved gradually on the principle of separation between the state, market and civil society. The underlying assumption of this separation were the following. First, the state is a coercive agent and is motivated by power. Therefore, the process of acquiring and exercising power should be well defined and checked through legal mechanisms. Second, economic activity is motivated by material incentives and is to be regulated by the market mechanism in terms of free exchange of goods and services. Third, civil society is the space for free voluntary activity of citizens between the state and the market, the zone in which a variety of political actions could be initiated to moderate the political authoritarianism of the state and the likely rapacity of the market. In the West, market, civil society and the state emerged successively, and each of these spheres acquired a certain level of autonomy. In contrast to the separation principle of capitalist democracies, the socialist states functioned on the institutional principle of fusion of the three entities, that is state, civil society and the market. The party state monopolized all powers and regulated the market and civil society. From the command economy of the socialist state, the market disappeared and the civil society was absorbed by the states. The conjoined activities of the one party system and its numerous front organizations came to be called as people's democracy. In the beginning, capitalist democracies were mainly concerned with creating congenial conditions for their citizens to pursue their preferred pattern of life, protecting them from external aggression and providing them with internal security. But the emergence of socialist states, which put economic welfare of citizens on the state agenda, posed major challenges for capitalist democracies. Understandably, 20th century capitalist societies reinvented themselves as welfare states, wherein the civil society assumed an important role. What were considered to be the private worries of individuals became public issues to be handled by the state. Most of the colonial states became politically independent by mid-20th century and took over the agenda of socialist and welfare states in different combinations, and India was no exception. Independent India opted for what we characterize as the third way, that is combining multi-party democracy, one of the distinctive features of capitalist states, with planned economy, the hallmark of socialist states. This was indeed a challenging experiment in that the best of both models were attempted to be incorporated into one model. However, it was planned economy and state centrism which assumed salience in the first 3 decades of independent India. The state promoted economic development, initiated a series of measures to introduce and institutionalize people's participation. The state thus partly took over the functions of the market and the role of civil society and occupied the commanding position. But laterally, what you find is, with the globalization which is coming into vogue, the state has retreated, the market has expanded, and the civil society start getting a bigger role. So we are at the moment at a situation in India where civil society is becoming more visible and audible, and it has become one of the important elements in the polity, along with the state as well as the market. And that is how I would like to look at the kind of changes that have taken place over a period of time from in independent India, from the period of planned economy to that of the structural adjustment program.
So, what kind of challenges you visualize in this backdrop, the kind of evolution of the civil society, the way kind of a Western way these were visualized. Now, in Indian context, we are finding a paradigmatic shift in the pre-independent period, in the post-independent period, again this structural adjustment period. So, what kind of challenges you visualize for the civil societies?
You see, during the planned period or a period of planned economic development, the state occupied the commanding position. The market was very substantially controlled by the state, and civil society was there. It had a space, but that was a very limited space. But with the market becoming very important or occupying a very central position in the context of globalization or structural adjustment program, the state has retreated from various areas, and in a certain sense the state's control over the civil society has loosened, and that has become a big challenge for the civil society to articulate, to become audible, and therefore the relationship between a state and civil society has changed. Earlier, in a certain sense, civil society was subservient to the state, because the state initiated civil society. But now the civil society has two edges. One, there are contexts in which the civil society work in collaboration with the state, for example, implementation of the various programs. But there are contexts in which the civil society interrogates, questions the state. That means the challenge of civil society today is that on certain issues and contexts it supports the state, but in several issues it opposes the state. It does not have the kind of subservient relationship that it had earlier, and that is one of the important developments that is taking place. Of course, it has other implications. Civil society is also becoming very substantially international or global. With the result, you will find a lot of money flowing into the civil society coffins from abroad. To that extent, its financial autonomy is greater. It becomes less and less dependent on the state, and therefore its capacity to interrogate the state also increases. As far as the market is concerned, because of globalization, it is also regulated by the global forces. And many contexts, civil society has to question some of the things which are happening in the context of the market. For example, consumer rights. If consumer rights are to be protected, it is not so much always the state which comes to the forefront, but the civil society.
Now, sir, we can see two situation, a paradoxical situation. On the one hand, there is the process of NGOification of the civil society at the grassroots, widely talking about. Also, there has been a process of co-option of the civil society activism at the grassroots level by the state in several modes. That is one. Another is that there is a space maybe coming from the above at the middle level, where the civil society is asserting. So, how do you find this kind of a tension at the grassroots level, at the top level, where the civil society is located today?
You see, first of all, when you talk about the state, you must understand the state is not a monolithic entity. It is a layered system. In India, for example, we have the federal or union level, we have the provincial states, we have in some cases autonomous regions, there are districts, there are panchayats. Now, what is the relationship between the civil society and with the different layers of the state will be different. Maybe at one layer the civil society may have in a given context a very friendly relationship, but at another layer it may have a hostile relationship. For example, at the policy level a lot of civil society inputs comes. But at the implementation level, there is a gap between the promise and the practice. At that level, there may be tension between civil society and that particular level of the or layer of the state which is expected to implement it. That is one. The other I have already indicated that civil society again is not a monolithic entity.
Yeah.
There are civil societies which continuously interrogate the very model of development.
Yeah.
For example, some of them would argue that what we have in India is not sustainable development but destructive development. Think of the Narmada Bachao Andolan as a classic case.
Yeah.
So, they will question the very policy of the state. But there are NGOs which would say that in order that people's participation is augmented at the grassroots level, it is quite unlikely that the government bureaucracy can do that, and therefore, it is better that the civil society does. At that level, the civil society and the state works in unison, in cooperation, but in some other contexts, certainly they are at loggerheads.
Yeah. So, now that we are standing in the threshold of a knowledge economy, the big knowledge economy we are going up, and we visualize that educational institution will play a big role to create that kind of a manpower for this knowledge society and knowledge economy. Now, how to visualize the role of the educational institution as the civil society, what kind of control or the tilt towards the state or tilt towards the market you are getting from the educational institution. So, what kind of role you visualize for the educational institution as a civil society in the contemporary world?
You see, in almost all countries in the world, including the crass capitalist countries, the state has made very great investment in order to develop knowledge. Application of knowledge is a different matter. I am not talking about it. I mean, look at the scientific laboratories. It is the state, the entire West, which has invested in the development of this. There are always some exceptions, some private foundations. So, when it comes to the production, the creation of a knowledge society, the central role of production of knowledge will have to lie with the state. But when it comes to the application of knowledge, how exactly this knowledge is taken out to the people and how it is put to use for the welfare of the people, then of course I find civil society has a big role to play. I don't even think that market will really invest enough adequately for the production of knowledge. They will certainly reap the benefit of the knowledge which is produced, but they don't want to invest, and that is a great dilemma that we have to face, because the state is asked to withdraw, the market is coming full bloom as it were, and the civil society is alive and kicking, but there are certain functions which cannot be transferred from the state to the civil society or market. Production of knowledge, I believe, is a central function of the state.
How do you visualize the role of the media? Do you like to consider media as a civil society organization?
Of course it is.
Or state-owned media, we talk about the part of the state. The private media, we talk about the civil society organ. I mean, this tension, how to...
You see, here again, there was a time, as I have indicated earlier, the civil society was very substantially controlled by the state. Think of Doordarshan, for example, in this country. It was government controlled, but today we have several channels. So, even the government sponsored channels will have to be extremely careful in conducting their affairs, because there are other alternate channels which will challenge. But the Indian press has always been independent of the government largely, although it has been argued that the Indian press was very much in the hands of capitalists. But even as it is, there is one can say without great difficulty that the independence of the press has always been maintained. Similarly, the independence of the electronic media is increasingly evident. So, the press and the media will have to be considered as an important dimension of civil society, but standing apart both from the state and the market, even when it is sponsored or financed by the state, because if that is not happening, the credibility of the media will be lost.
Yeah. I go back to your earlier conceptualization of the civil society. Well, you are referring to Gramsci, the way Gramsci talked about civil society, a space where the contestation against the hegemony of the state is constructed and it is reflected. Do you still visualize that civil society can create or use that space to contest the hegemony of the state in the wake of globalization, structural adjustment program, this Washington consensus, all those varieties of institutional arrangement?
It should be possible, and that is why I said right in the beginning, a good society, although I haven't used the term then, today is conceptualized as a society which stands on 3 pillars. And each of these have some amount of autonomy, but at the same time they also have reciprocity. So, autonomy and reciprocity between these 3 pillars that we are talking about makes a society a good society, and therefore you can't think in terms of what has happened once upon a time in the so-called socialist or totalitarian societies. The problem with the Gramscian understanding was that the state, Gramsci's state has actually absorbed the civil society, and therefore there was nobody to interrogate in his rendition of things, the state. The market was not very much a part of that those days, but today market also is in a way contesting the state autonomy indirectly, if not directly. So, the ideal state would be a situation in which autonomy and reciprocity between these 3 pillars are institutionalized and recognized and respected.
It is more of a persuasive rather than coercive. Maybe that is the way.
Coercive, see, look, coercive apparatuses are necessary, but not always. Wherever consent is possible, accepted, we must go by that. In other words, the ideal state would be a state in which non-violence prevails and pervades. But there may be contexts in which individuals and groups may be doing things which are not socially healthy. In such a situation, if coercion is needed in adequate measure, in control measure, the state will have to use it.
Okay, thank you, Professor Oman, for coming over here and giving a very lucid and simplified description of the civil society, its constitution, functioning, its transition and possible role in the contemporary world in the wake of civilization. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.